The village of Stretton-on-Sea, ordinarily so serene that even the faintest ripple of news travelled like wind over still water, was now alive with a restless energy. As Miss Marple made her way back along the narrow, cobbled streets toward her cottage, she observed the subtle ways in which the incident at the station had already begun to alter the rhythm of daily life. The bakery, usually a sanctuary of warm bread and polite nods, hummed with low, urgent conversation. Mr. Fenton, the proprietor, leaned on the counter as if the weight of the entire village rested on his shoulders, speaking in hushed tones to the postman who had just delivered letters. The news had arrived there before Miss Marple herself, spreading faster than the morning mist that still clung to the edges of the thatched rooftops. At the corner, Mrs. Lacey had gathered a small group outside the general store. She gesticulated dramatically, her parasol slicing the air with each emphatic point. "It's ghastly, right under our noses," she said, and though her voice carried the usual flair for exaggeration, her eyes were sharp, scanning the faces around her for reactions. Villagers nodded gravely, whispering their own conjectures. One suggested the man might have been fleeing some distant trouble. Another was certain it was a crime of passion. Children clustered nearby, their curiosity brimming as they tugged at each other's sleeves, catching snippets of adult speculation and repeating them with emphatic gestures. Miss Marple, walking quietly past them, noted each detail with an ease born of long practice. She observed the way Mr. Fenton's hands trembled as he poured tea for a nervous patron, the stiffness of Mrs. Lacey's stance when she emphasized the word ghastly, the restless movement of the postman who seemed eager to leave. To the untrained eye, these might have seemed minor or irrelevant, but to her, they were threads waiting to be drawn together. By late morning, the constable had established a small cordon near the station, permitting only those with pressing business to approach. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, found herself lingering near the edge of the crowd, where she could observe without being noticed. She saw the tall man in the black coat again, leaning slightly against the station wall, eyes following the constable's every movement. There was something deliberate in his stillness, something calculated that spoke of familiarity with uncertainty, an observer rather than a mere passer-by. A few villagers had ventured closer to the scene, whispering between themselves as if proximity might grant insight. One woman, Mrs. Petheridge, wrung her hands and remarked, "Who knows what he was carrying? Perhaps letters or money. Oh, it could be anything." Another scoffed gently. "Nonsense, my dear. It's much simpler than that. Perhaps a quarrel with a fellow passenger or an unfortunate accident as he alighted." Each explanation, Miss Marple noted, was framed not by evidence, but by hope. The hope of coherence, of a tidy narrative that made the shocking inexplicable seem manageable. Her path took her past the post office, where she paused to exchange a few quiet words with Mr. Crabbe, the clerk. He had seen the body when it was first removed from the train and had come away, looking pale and somewhat shaken. "Curious, isn't it, Miss Marple?" he said, voice lowered, "that there was no ticket found? I cannot fathom how one might travel thus unnoticed." Miss Marple nodded, pretending to ponder the observation casually. Yet in her mind, she catalogued it carefully. The absence of a ticket was small, but anomalies often held secrets, and small details could unravel the greatest of deceptions. By midday, the village square itself had taken on the air of a courtroom, with neighbors assuming the roles of jurors and witnesses alike. Voices rose and fell, some speculating about the man's origins, others drawing on fragments of remembered conversations or fleeting impressions from previous encounters with strangers. Miss Marple, though engaged in a quiet exchange with Mrs. Crabbe about the oddities of the local flora, had her attention elsewhere. She watched with gentle amusement and keen interest the social dynamics unfolding. Suspicion, she observed, often mirrored the hidden resentments of the community itself. A minor insult remembered from a garden party months ago, could grow into vehement certainty when filtered through fear and excitement. The station master, Mr. Pritchard, now emerged with a clipboard, calling the crowd to order in his usual officious tone. He attempted to reassure everyone that the police were in charge, that evidence was being collected, and that the matter would soon be resolved. But reassurance, Miss Marple knew, often fell flat when curiosity and fear had taken root. People whispered in corners, sharing fragments of what they had seen or imagined. Every glance, every whispered comment became a thread of narrative, some plausible, some wildly fanciful. Even at the tea shop, where she paused for a brief cup, Miss Marple sensed the underlying tensions as villagers passed, stopping to exchange hurried insights. A slight nod here, a hasty withdrawal there. Tiny, almost imperceptible signals of human nature revealing themselves. And all the while, the man in the black coat had not left the vicinity, and that, more than anything, stirred Miss Marple's curiosity. For in her experience, the observer often concealed more than the observed. As the sun climbed higher, scattering light across the seaside rooftops, the quiet hum of the village had shifted. Stretton-on-Sea, calm though it appeared, was alive with speculation, suspicion, and secrets. And somewhere, amid the chatter, amid the polite lies and half-formed truths, Miss Marple knew the first real clue was waiting. Not in the commotion, but in the subtle reactions of those who thought they were merely spectators. She sipped her tea, allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips, and made a silent note. Patience, observation, and quiet reasoning would reveal more than alarm ever could. By late afternoon, the stir of activity around Stretton-on-Sea had begun to settle into a curious rhythm. The crowd at the station had thinned, leaving only the more interested, or perhaps more restless, villagers lingering like moths around the faintly humming lamp of the police investigation. Miss Marple, having taken her time in a leisurely walk through the village, found herself once again near the station, not from any obligation, but from an instinctive sense that observation, rather than questioning, often revealed more than inquiries could. She noted that Inspector Harris, the local detective, was meticulously cataloguing the scene with the assistance of Constable Bell. They moved with the careful deliberation of professionals, photographing the carriage and examining the corners with magnifying glass and gloves. Yet Miss Marple could see that, beneath the veneer of procedure, there was a certain eagerness to find a simple answer, a desire to identify an obvious culprit and close the matter swiftly. It was, she reflected, a common inclination. Humans preferred a tidy solution to a tangled truth. Her attention drifted first to the conductor, who hovered near the cordon, continually straightening his uniform and glancing toward the police, with a tension that suggested unease far deeper than mere responsibility. Miss Marple recalled Mr. Crabbe's remark from that morning about the lack of a ticket. That small irregularity, which others had dismissed as clerical error or carelessness, now returned to her mind like a persistent shadow. Something in the way the conductor's eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd suggested that he was aware of details no one else had yet grasped. Meanwhile, villagers passed by, offering scraps of information and conjecture. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Hobbs, insisted that the deceased had been a foreigner, though no evidence supported the claim. A young woman, Miss Arden, declared that she had seen the man arguing with someone before boarding, though her recollection wavered under gentle questioning. Miss Marple listened, as she always did, to these fragments of memory, discerning not what was said, but the truths concealed within hesitations, inconsistencies, and emphases. As she observed, her gaze returned once more to the tall man in the black coat. He had shifted slightly, leaning casually against a lamp-post now, as though he had been waiting for something, or someone for hours. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes followed each passer-by and each police movement, careful but unobtrusive. There was an alertness in him that did not belong to a mere bystander. Yet he said nothing, made no gesture, and left no trace of his thoughts behind. To a casual observer, he might appear composed. To Miss Marple, he was significant. A sudden commotion drew her attention to the carriage itself. One of the villagers, a young man named Peter Langley, had edged closer than permitted, curious about the interior. Inspector Harris's sharp voice stopped him, but not before Peter glimpsed something, a small leather case carelessly left near the deceased's feet. It was minor, almost incidental, and yet the careful way it had been overlooked by the initial inspection piqued Miss Marple's interest. She made a discreet mental note to inquire about it later, understanding instinctively that objects, like people, sometimes revealed secrets through their mere placement. A few minutes later, she wandered to the edge of the station garden where the neatly trimmed hedges framed the distant sea. There, seated on a bench, was the maid who had first discovered the body. Miss Marple approached slowly, speaking in her soft, deliberate manner, encouraging confidence rather than fear. The girl, a slight figure with anxious eyes, looked up and hesitated, then spoke in a rush. I thought I saw someone near the last carriage before I found him, but when I looked properly, I couldn't be sure. Her hands twisted nervously in her apron. Miss Marple nodded gently, her eyes kind but probing. You needn't be frightened. Sometimes, noticing something small can help us understand much greater things. Tell me exactly what you saw, just as you remember it, even if you are uncertain. The girl recounted a vague shadow, a movement too fleeting to identify, yet the hesitation in her voice hinted at an observation she had discounted as insignificant. Miss Marple's mind catalogued it carefully. It was precisely in such overlooked moments that truth often hid. By now, the late afternoon light had softened, bathing the station in a gentle gold. The sea breeze carried a faint tang of salt, mixing with the scent of coal smoke from the departing trains. Villagers wandered past, their conversations shrinking to murmurs, their glances furtive, as though the shadow of the morning's tragedy still hovered over them. Miss Marple, sitting quietly on a low wall, allowed herself a small smile. In every glance, every twitch of a hand, every pause in speech, she perceived a subtle pattern, a network of small, human truths that, when woven together, could reveal a far larger picture. As the inspector conferred with the station master and the remaining villagers, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing invisible lines, connections between the man's presence, the strange observer in black, the nervous conductor, and the fleeting glimpse from the maid. The village appeared calm on the surface, yet beneath it, currents of tension and secrets ran deep. And Miss Marple, as always, knew that those currents, if followed with patience and care, would eventually lead to the truth. For now, she remained in her customary role, quiet, watching and thinking, understanding that revelation often came, not through the loud assertions of others, but through the small, unnoticed details that whispered in silence. The following morning brought a muted sun over Stretton-on-Sea, painting the village in pale gold and soft shadows that flickered over the cobblestones and the thatched rooftops. Miss Marple, having risen early as was her habit, prepared for a quiet walk before the town's usual stir. She carried a small notebook tucked beneath her arm, not for official purposes, but to record impressions, the kind of subtle observations that often proved more revealing than evidence formally gathered. As she moved through the streets, she noticed the lingering tension from the previous day. Shopkeepers greeted her politely, but with a cautious glance toward the station. Children whispered in hushed tones as they darted past, casting nervous looks over their shoulders. Even the sea seemed subdued, the waves rolling in without their usual exuberant energy. Miss Marple's first stop was the small tea shop where villagers frequently gathered, and today it hummed with subdued conversation rather than its usual cheerful bustle. A few faces from the station yesterday sat together, cups clutched in hands that shook just slightly, voices lowered as if speaking above a whisper might disturb the delicate balance of order. The young maid, who had discovered the body, sat at a corner table, fidgeting with her napkin, her eyes darting toward the door whenever it opened. Miss Marple approached her gently, smiling in that unassuming way that often disarmed hesitation. "Good morning," she said softly. "I wondered if you might help me understand something from yesterday. You saw something unusual near the last carriage, did you not?" The girl's lips parted slightly, and after a brief pause, she nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I thought it was nothing at first, but there was a man, or a shadow of a man, moving quickly. I only saw him from the corner of my eye, and then he was gone." Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful, noting the slight quiver in the girl's hands and the way she avoided direct eye contact. The mind often discards what it does not understand, she reflected. Yet the body remembers. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple continued toward the station, observing with her habitual attention to detail. The carriage from which the deceased had been removed now sat cordoned off, a temporary shelter of canvas, shielding it from the public eye. Inspector Harris and Constable Bell were present, and the station master hovered near the edge, clipboard in hand. The villagers who had remained curious lingered at a respectful distance, exchanging speculative remarks that ranged from the mundane to the outlandish. Miss Marple, moving slowly, allowed herself to appear absorbed in the flowers lining the platform while she noted each expression, each nervous twitch, each glance that darted too quickly or lingered too long. Her attention returned to the tall man in the black coat, now standing near the edge of the station garden. Unlike the others, he made no effort to blend into the crowd. His posture was relaxed yet precise, and his gaze was fixed on the cordoned-off carriage, following every movement of the officials. There was a quiet confidence in him, an almost imperceptible tension in the set of his shoulders. Miss Marple, observing him from across the garden, realized that he had been waiting for something, or someone, before the body was discovered, and had remained since, carefully measuring his presence. By mid-morning, the inspector had begun questioning villagers who had been closest to the scene. Miss Marple, not wishing to draw attention, lingered nearby, listening with an ear for inconsistencies. One man, a local shopkeeper named Thomas Ridley, recounted that he had seen the deceased glance nervously over his shoulder on the train, muttering to himself. Another, Mrs. Harding, insisted she had overheard a heated argument between two passengers in the previous carriage, though she could recall no details. Each account, she noted, was filtered through fear or imagination, yet within the hesitations and contradictions lay faint traces of truth. Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by the conductor approaching, his face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, as though confiding a secret, "there's something you should know. The last carriage, the deceased, he wasn't alone for long before boarding. He hesitated, then continued in a rush. Someone gave him a package. I don't know who, but it was small, leather-bound, and he tucked it under his coat." Miss Marple inclined her head slowly, her mind immediately cataloguing the information. That small, leather-bound package might have been trivial to others, yet in her experience, such objects often carried weight far greater than their appearance suggested. While the inspector continued official questioning, Miss Marple noted that the villagers' attention began to shift subtly. Whispers spread regarding the package, the foreign origin of the deceased, and the mysterious observer in black, each theory growing in confidence as it circulated. Yet Miss Marple, with a calm and deliberate gaze, remained focused on the patterns beneath the chatter, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the slight tightening of lips, the faintest hesitation before speech. Human nature, she reflected, revealed itself most clearly in the quiet moments, not in the declarations of alarm. As the sun reached its zenith, glinting over the station's iron railings, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief pause to survey the scene. She considered the maid's shadowy observation, the conductor's revelation about the package, the tall man in black, and the shifting expressions of the villagers. All of it, she knew instinctively, formed a web, delicate, complex, and deceptive in its apparent simplicity. And at the center of it, obscured by fear, imagination, and the eagerness of those who preferred easy conclusions, lay the truth waiting to be discerned. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a quiet certainty in her heart. The day's investigation had only just begun, and already the first threads of discovery had presented themselves, ready to be followed with patience, care, and the subtle art of observation she had perfected over many years. By mid-afternoon, the village of Stretton-on-Sea had settled into a peculiar hush, a sort of anticipatory stillness that followed the morning's flurry of speculation. Miss Marple, strolling past the neatly trimmed hedgerows along the lane to the station, observed how the villagers' curiosity had begun to manifest in quieter, more calculated ways. Shop windows were now places of observation, not commerce. Neighbors lingered near gates and fences, eyes darting like birds between passer-by and platform. The air carried a faint saltiness from the sea, mingled with the warm sense of fresh bread and brewing tea. But beneath it lingered an intangible tension, a recognition that something had disturbed the village's usual equilibrium. She paused briefly at the station garden, noting again the tall man in the black coat. He had shifted position, leaning casually against the wrought iron fence, hands clasped lightly behind him, yet his gaze never left the cordoned-off carriage. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. That kind of watchfulness, so deliberate and composed, rarely belonged to a mere onlooker. She made a quiet, mental note to inquire after him later, knowing that patience often revealed more than direct questioning. Nearby, Inspector Harris was speaking with the conductor, who appeared increasingly uneasy. Miss Marple, approaching from a discreet distance, could see the subtle signs of distress. The conductor's rigid posture, the frequent glance toward the tall man, the way his hands fidgeted with his cap. Something about the conductor's anxiety seemed disproportionate to the situation, and Miss Marple's mind catalogued it alongside the morning's revelations. The absence of a ticket, the mysterious package, the shadowy movement observed by the maid, all these threads hinted at an underlying tension that few had yet considered seriously. A group of villagers had gathered at the edge of the cordon, speaking in hushed tones. Mrs. Lacey, as expected, was at the center, her parasol waving gently as she narrated her version of events. "I tell you, it is all far too convenient. Such a man arriving here, alone, without anyone knowing. There is a story behind this, mark my words." Others nodded, offering their own embellishments. An overheard quarrel, a mislaid document, perhaps even something more sinister. Miss Marple, walking slowly past, observed each face carefully. The eagerness with which people conformed their memories to the desired narrative often left subtle inconsistencies, tiny tells that revealed as much as confession. From the platform, a young man named Peter Langley approached, his movements hesitant. "Miss Marple," he said, voice lowered, "I think I may have seen something that might help." He glanced nervously toward the cordoned carriage, then lowered his voice even further. "I saw a small leather-bound case near the man's feet before the police moved it. I thought it belonged to the deceased, but perhaps it was placed there by someone else." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of her notebook as if to adjust it, but she made no note yet. The significance of the case was not in its presence, but in the intention behind its placement. By now, Inspector Harris had begun to interview some of the more prominent villagers, seeking details that could provide motive or context. Miss Marple lingered at a comfortable distance, letting the interviews unfold while she observed. A local shopkeeper, Mr. Ridley, recounted seeing the deceased glance nervously over his shoulder on the train. Another, Mrs. Harding, insisted on hearing fragments of a dispute, though she could recall nothing concrete. Miss Marple's attention, however, rested less on the words than on the pauses, the micro-expressions, the small hesitations that betrayed uncertainty or concealment. Her gaze returned again to the tall man in black, who had shifted slightly closer to the station entrance. His movements were minimal yet precise. He adjusted his coat just so, surveyed the crowd, and occasionally glanced toward the inspector. There was an intelligence in his composure, a careful balance between observation and invisibility. Miss Marple knew from experience that such people often had the greatest reason to remain unnoticed. She allowed herself to imagine a variety of scenarios, weighing them lightly in her mind without revealing her thoughts. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple decided to approach the conductor. "Good afternoon," she said gently, her tone casual yet attentive. "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity. The last carriage yesterday, did anything about the deceased strike you as unusual?" The conductor blinked, surprised at being addressed so directly, then hesitated. "Well, yes, ma'am. It's just that—" He seemed nervous, as though expecting someone. "And the package, it was odd. I don't know where it came from, but he handled it with care, almost fearfully." His words were careful, measured, yet the tension in his voice betrayed unease he could not conceal. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful, masking the rapid connections forming in her mind. Every detail, the nervous glance, the careful handling of the package, the silent observer, the fleeting shadow seen by the maid, added weight to a slowly emerging pattern. The village might seek explanations that were immediate and simple, but she knew that the truth, as always, would be more subtle, woven through human behavior rather than announced, in a flourish. She allowed herself a small, patient smile. The investigation had only begun, but already the outlines of a mystery were becoming visible to those who knew how to see. By the following morning, the village of Stretton-on-Sea had begun to settle into a deceptive semblance of normality. The news of the deceased passenger had circulated beyond the station, threading its way through every household, shop, and garden path, and yet, for all the gossip, the precise circumstances remained elusive. Miss Marple, moving with quiet deliberation along the main street, observed the subtle ways in which the village had adjusted to the disruption. The baker's boy lingered a moment too long at doorways, casting glances toward the station. The postman delivered letters with unusual haste, eyes flicking toward the upper windows of cottages. Even the wind seemed to carry a weight, as though it too had absorbed the tension that clung to the village like morning mist. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of succumbing to the general speculation. She had begun to assemble the disparate threads of information in her mind. The nervous conductor, the mysterious leather-bound package, the fleeting shadow seen by the maid, the tall man in the black coat who remained near the station, and the erratic stories provided by the villagers. Each detail, seemingly unremarkable on its own, hinted at patterns that the casual observer would miss. She made her way first to the station, a deliberate pace that allowed her to observe the constellations of behavior around her without drawing notice. The inspector, accompanied by Constable Bell, was speaking with Mr. Ridley and Mrs. Harding. Both had returned to clarify or expand upon their accounts from the previous day. "It seems," the inspector said, voice authoritative, "that we may have someone to consider more closely. There are witnesses who place a man in a dark coat near the last carriage before the body was discovered, and he appears to have been following the deceased during the journey." His tone carried certainty, the sort that comes from an official willing to close a case quickly. Miss Marple observed the reactions of those around. The villagers murmured, some nodding with the eagerness of those who had longed for a tangible suspect. Yet in the conductor's face she noted an odd flicker, something akin to alarm, though quickly masked by professionalism. The tall man in the black coat, meanwhile, had not moved. He continued to stand near the edge of the platform, composed but alert, as though he had heard every word and found it either amusing or irrelevant. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, and she realized that the inspector's declaration, though it satisfied public curiosity, had failed to account for subtle discrepancies she had already noted. She decided to speak with the conductor, who now hovered near the cordon with his hands clasped nervously before him. "Good morning," she said gently, approaching with her usual air of unobtrusive concern. "I hope you do not mind a small question from an old friend of the village. Yesterday, when you observed the deceased, did anything strike you as peculiar? Perhaps something others might have overlooked?" The conductor swallowed audibly, his eyes shifting toward the tall man, then back to her. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally. "It's not just the package, it's the way he handled it, and that he seemed to anticipate someone's arrival. He looked over his shoulder as though expecting trouble, and yet the carriage was empty when he entered. Something about his manner suggested he was waiting for someone, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile on her lips. The timing of the events was beginning to form a subtle rhythm in her mind, a pattern of anticipation and interaction that the inspector had not yet perceived. She considered the sequence: the arrival of the deceased, the handling of the package, the fleeting shadow observed by the maid, the silent man in black, the nervous conductor. It was all connected, though the connection remained hidden beneath layers of human behavior, distraction, and assumption. At that moment, the tall man in the black coat moved slightly, walking with casual precision along the edge of the platform as though adjusting his position to remain inconspicuous. Villagers noticed, some whispering guesses about his identity: an agent, a journalist, perhaps an acquaintance of the deceased. But Miss Marple considered the subtler possibilities. His presence was deliberate. His composure was a careful mask. Yet the inspector, eager for resolution, seemed content to focus on the more apparent connections, the immediate shadow of guilt, rather than the nuanced interactions that often revealed truth. Miss Marple continued her silent observations, noting also the small reactions of the villagers. Mrs. Lacey, for example, had shifted her parasol nervously when the man in black passed by, and Peter Langley fidgeted with the edge of his coat, as though conscious of being observed. Each of these minute details, while insignificant to casual eyes, suggested undercurrents of familiarity, unease, or anticipation. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, had its own language, a language often ignored by those too eager for conclusions. By the late morning, she had decided upon her next course. She would engage more directly with the villagers, not in the formal manner of the police, but in her gentle, unassuming way, drawing out what they knew or feared without prompting alarm. She began with the maid, asking further about the shadow she had seen, and then with Peter Langley regarding the leather-bound case. In each instance, she listened not merely to their words, but to the pauses, the emphasis, the nervous adjustments of body and voice. Already, a picture was beginning to emerge, faint and tentative, but coherent, a pattern of expectation, observation, and subtle manipulation. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the platform, Miss Marple remained quietly composed, the first hints of understanding stirring in her mind. The inspector may have been content with an apparent suspect, the villagers eager for resolution, but she knew better. The truth was concealed in the small, almost imperceptible details in human reactions and behaviors. And she was determined, as always, to follow those details wherever they led, unraveling the hidden threads of Stretton-on-Sea's newest and most perplexing mystery. By the early evening, a quiet unease had settled over Stretton-on-Sea, a palpable tension that stretched from the station to the narrow lanes winding toward the sea. The villagers moved with a subdued energy, their conversations cautious, glances furtive, as though the events of the past 2 days had awakened a latent awareness of human unpredictability. Miss Marple, having spent much of the afternoon observing from a distance, now walked purposefully toward the central square, where the town's small community tended to gather. She carried her habitual notebook tucked under her arm, though she rarely needed to record more than fleeting impressions. It was the quiet reading of human behavior that revealed the deepest truths. The station, meanwhile, remained a center of activity. Inspector Harris had begun assembling preliminary accounts, questioning those who had observed the deceased and attempting to piece together a coherent timeline. To Miss Marple, however, the official investigation seemed overly focused on visible evidence, on the easily interpreted gestures of guilt, rather than the subtler currents flowing beneath the village's polite surface. She noticed, for instance, that the conductor remained unusually close to the cordon, eyes darting toward the tall man in the black coat whenever he moved. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers fidgeted with his cap, suggested a concern he could not openly acknowledge. Miss Marple paused to observe a small group of villagers near the edge of the square. Mrs. Lacey, as expected, had taken a central role, her parasol waving gently as she narrated the events with growing drama. Others leaned in, nodding or whispering, embellishing the story to fit their own preconceptions. One man, Mr. Ridley, insisted he had glimpsed a second shadow in the carriage, a detail quickly dismissed by the inspector as imagination. Miss Marple, however, tucked it away as a subtle inconsistency, understanding that discrepancies often concealed the paths that led to truth. She wandered further, noting the young maid who had first discovered the body now seated on a bench, hands trembling slightly over a folded cloth. Miss Marple approached, speaking with her usual gentleness. "Tell me once more, dear, about the shadow you saw. Every detail, no matter how small, may be important." The girl recounted it again, slower this time, her eyes bright with remembered unease. "It was just for a moment, ma'am," she said, but the figure moved toward the carriage, then stopped as if watching something or someone inside. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. The observation was fleeting, yet it suggested intentionality, someone who had anticipated an event rather than stumbled upon it. Her attention shifted back to the platform, where the tall man in black continued to observe the scene, his movements minimal but precise. Villagers speculated aloud about his identity. A private detective, perhaps, or an acquaintance of the deceased, but Miss Marple considered subtler possibilities. He was deliberately maintaining a balance between visibility and inconspicuousness, a careful management of attention that bespoke knowledge, intent, and perhaps anxiety. She noted the faint crease in his brow when the conductor moved too close, the ever-so-slight glance he cast toward the inspector. His presence was purposeful, but the purpose remained hidden to all but the most attentive observer. By now, a sense of competition had developed between the villagers' theories and the inspector's line of questioning. Some sought a straightforward culprit, a convenient suspect to satisfy their curiosity and restore order. Others preferred more elaborate conjectures, inventing motives and connections that often bore no relation to the actual events. Miss Marple, moving quietly through the throng, listened not to what was said, but to what remained unspoken. The hesitations, the sidelong glances, the subtle contradictions in each story. In human behavior, she knew, truth often lingered in the spaces between words, revealed not by declaration, but by instinctive, unguarded action. A sudden shift in the crowd's attention drew her gaze to Peter Langley, who had approached the cordon once more. His hands clutched something small and leather-bound. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as the case mentioned earlier, the one observed near the deceased's feet. Peter's movements were hesitant, and he looked around as though uncertain whether he should display it openly. The inspector called him forward, and Peter explained how he had seen it before the body was removed and had retrieved it afterward, believing it might be significant. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the detail carefully. The package's presence, its handling, the eagerness with which the inspector seized upon it, all elements in a delicate tableau of human interaction. Evening shadows began to lengthen across the platform, softening the edges of the scene and casting long, subtle patterns across the cobbles. Miss Marple remained quietly observant, considering the movements of each individual. The conductor, tense and watchful; the tall man in black, calm yet purposeful; the villagers, eager for narrative and closure; the inspector, confident in his own reasoning yet missing the nuances of behavior that often betrayed the deepest truths. The interplay of anticipation, concealment, and subtle disclosure formed a tapestry that, to an untrained eye, might appear chaotic, yet to Miss Marple was beginning to reveal the first coherent outlines of intention and action. By the time the sun touched the horizon, casting a delicate glow over the station's iron railings and the distant sea, Miss Marple had drawn the first tentative connections. The deceased had arrived with a purpose. The package carried significance. The shadow observed by the maid suggested deliberate observation, and the tall man in black was no mere bystander. Each villager's story, each hesitated word, each nervous glance was a piece of a larger puzzle. And as she walked slowly back toward the village, notebook tucked discreetly under her arm, she allowed herself the faintest smile of satisfaction. The early threads of the mystery were beginning to form, and the subtle patterns of human behavior were revealing more than any overt evidence could. The next morning dawned pale and still over Stretton-on-Sea, the kind of quiet that carried its own intensity, as if the village itself held its breath. Miss Marple, leaving her cottage with a small satchel and notebook, took her habitual route past the post office and along the high street, noting that even in these mundane surroundings, the echoes of the previous day's events persisted. Shopkeepers greeted her with polite nods, their eyes wary, as though the morning light had not yet dispelled the tension that lingered from the tragic discovery on the platform. Children whispered among themselves while avoiding her gaze, and the faint scent of salt carried inland, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way back to the station, where activity had resumed under a carefully maintained order. Inspector Harris was directing the movement of villagers, taking statements and attempting to reconstruct the deceased's movements from the moment he arrived in the village. Constable Bell followed with meticulous attention, making notes in his small book, while the conductor hovered nearby, still tense but increasingly cooperative. Miss Marple, leaning lightly against a railing, allowed herself the appearance of casual observation, though her mind worked swiftly to arrange each new piece of information into the broader pattern she was beginning to perceive. Her attention first fell to Peter Langley, who had returned with a small leather-bound case, now opened and inspected by the inspector. "It appears to be a notebook of some sort," the inspector remarked aloud, his voice carrying over the subdued murmurs of the villagers. "Nothing incriminating yet, but it could contain something of importance." Miss Marple studied the movements of those nearby, noting how Peter's fingers trembled slightly as he handled the pages, and how the conductor's gaze lingered on the notebook with a subtle, almost imperceptible tension. Small reactions, she reflected, were often more revealing than explicit words. Across the platform, the tall man in the black coat remained near the station garden, observing the proceedings with the same composed intensity as before. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, noting the faint crease between his brows as the inspector flipped through the pages of the notebook. He was deliberate in his movements, cautious yet attentive, the kind of quiet precision that suggested knowledge beyond that of a casual bystander. Villagers speculated aloud, their voices weaving theories of acquaintanceship, espionage, or coincidence, but Miss Marple understood that the truth was far subtler, hidden beneath layers of intent and observation. As the morning advanced, small confrontations of theory and conjecture began to surface. Mrs. Lacey, parasol raised in dramatic gesture, insisted to anyone who would listen that the man in black must have played a direct role in the tragedy. "I tell you," she whispered, "he's been watching us, following the deceased. You can see it in his very posture." Others nodded or shook their heads, each interpretation tinted by personal bias. Miss Marple observed with quiet interest, noting the way Mrs. Lacey's voice trembled ever so slightly when challenged, betraying the faint awareness that she might be exaggerating to satisfy her own need for narrative clarity. The conductor approached Miss Marple cautiously, lowering his voice. "Miss Marple," he said, glancing toward the tall man in black, "I'm not certain it is entirely fair to say the passenger was alone. There was someone on the platform before the body was discovered. I cannot be certain of the exact sequence, but it struck me as peculiar." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully, weighing his words. Peculiar, indeed, for in her experience, minor disturbances often concealed the decisive elements of a mystery, the details that eluded both casual observation and official inquiry. Miss Marple decided it was time to engage with Peter Langley once more. "You noticed the package on the platform," she said softly. "Do you recall exactly where it was placed in relation to the deceased?" Peter hesitated, then described its position near the deceased's feet, the leather glinting faintly in the morning sun. "It seemed as if he had set it down carefully before stepping back," he added. Miss Marple's lips curved in a small, discreet smile. The careful placement, combined with the other observations, the shadow, the tall man, the conductor's unease, was beginning to suggest a pattern of deliberate anticipation and interaction. Meanwhile, the inspector called the conductor aside to clarify timings and movements, and the villagers began to speculate more loudly about potential motives. Miss Marple allowed them to chatter, noting how their imaginations often supplied the narrative gaps left by incomplete information. She, by contrast, concentrated on the subtler details, the pauses before speech, the fleeting adjustments of posture, the barely perceptible reactions to questions and observations. Each of these micro-behaviors was a clue, and she catalogued them with the patient attention of a careful observer. By noon, the interplay of people, movements, and objects began to form a discernible pattern in Miss Marple's mind. The deceased had arrived anticipating contact. The package had significance beyond its appearance. The shadow observed by the maid suggested deliberate observation. The tall man in black was no mere passer-by, and the conductor's nervousness indicated knowledge not yet revealed. Villagers continued to offer their interpretations, yet none accounted for the subtleties Miss Marple had discerned. As she walked slowly toward the platform's edge, notebook at her side, she allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The threads of human behavior, carefully observed, were beginning to reveal the outlines of intention, and she knew that the first significant revelations were close at hand. As afternoon settled over Stretton-on-Sea, a subtle shift had occurred among the villagers. The initial shock of the tragedy had given way to a cautious engagement with the mystery, a desire to impose order upon events that refused simple explanation. Miss Marple, strolling along the station approach, observed this quietly, noting the interplay of curiosity, fear, and conjecture. Shopkeepers had closed early to gather information from travelers. Children lingered near corners and alleys to exchange whispered theories, and neighbors leaned over garden fences to recount partial observations from the platform. Each fragment, trivial though it seemed, formed a lattice of detail that Miss Marple could read with precision. At the station, Inspector Harris was reviewing the morning's statements, his brow furrowed in concentration. He appeared increasingly inclined to view the matter through the lens of the obvious suspect, the tall man in the black coat, whose presence near the cordon had already drawn the villagers' suspicion. Miss Marple noted how readily the inspector favored a visible thread over the subtler hints she had been cataloguing for days. The conductor's unease, the placement of the package, the fleeting shadow, and the careful movements of those who had observed the deceased. Human nature, she reflected, often made people grasp for a tidy narrative, even when the truth was far more intricate. Miss Marple approached the cordon with her usual unassuming air, greeting the conductor with gentle familiarity. "I wonder, dear," she said softly, "if you might indulge me further. Yesterday you mentioned that something about the deceased struck you as peculiar. Anticipation, perhaps, or careful timing. Could you describe precisely what you observed?" The conductor hesitated, then nodded, lowering his voice. "Yes, ma'am. He seemed to know that someone would meet him. There was no overt communication, but the way he held the package, the way he glanced around, even the way he moved on the platform, it suggested expectation. And yet, the person or persons he anticipated never appeared openly. It was almost as if he were managing an unseen conversation." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly in thought. Expectation, she mused, was often as telling as action, and anticipation, subtle though it might be, frequently left discernible traces in behavior, posture, and expression. She tucked her notebook under her arm and allowed herself a slow, deliberate survey of the surrounding villagers. Mrs. Lacey, now whispering to a small group of women, gestured toward the tall man in black, her expression oscillating between suspicion and excitement. Peter Langley, meanwhile, lingered near the package, occasionally glancing toward the cordon as though the inspector's scrutiny had left him uncertain. The man in black had shifted slightly along the platform, still observing with careful precision. Miss Marple noted the subtle changes in his posture when the inspector moved closer to Peter Langley, the faint tightening of his jaw and the brief flicker in his eyes as though measuring the situation. To the casual observer, these signs might seem inconsequential, but Miss Marple's long experience had taught her to interpret these micro-expressions as intentional and often deeply informative. Something about his awareness of everyone's movements, his silent engagement with each nuance, suggested both caution and calculation. By mid-afternoon, small confrontations of narrative had begun to arise. Mr. Ridley, eager to assert his observations, insisted that the deceased had argued with someone on the train, a detail he claimed was supported by overhearing a fragment of conversation. Mrs. Harding nodded in agreement, adding her own recollection of a fleeting gesture, while the inspector attempted to reconcile these reports with the movements of the man in black. Miss Marple, listening, detected contradictions, times misremembered, locations confused, and reactions colored by personal expectation. Yet within these inconsistencies lay hidden truths, subtle yet significant, ready to be discerned by an attentive mind. Turning her attention to Peter Langley, Miss Marple quietly inquired about the leather-bound case. "Do you recall if the deceased seemed to handle it cautiously?" she asked softly. Peter's hands twitched slightly. "Yes. He held it close, almost protectively. It wasn't merely a notebook, I think. It was something important to him, though I could not see what it contained." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Protective handling, combined with expectation and subtle observation, suggested a hierarchy of concern, perhaps even a sense of threat. The inspector, growing increasingly impatient, called for the villagers to disperse, but Miss Marple remained, allowing her gaze to wander across the scene. The interplay of observation, avoidance, anticipation, and subtle signals formed a delicate web. Each individual's behavior carried meaning: the conductor's nervous glances, Peter Langley's hesitant movements, Mrs. Lacey's theatrical suspicion, the man in black's calculated composure. Each element, when considered together, hinted at connections not yet openly acknowledged, secrets that had long been concealed, and motives that could not be inferred from a single act alone. As the afternoon waned, the sun casting long shadows over the platform and the distant sea beyond, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The villagers' theories remained scattered and often flawed. The inspector's assumptions leaned toward the obvious, yet the subtle threads she had been observing for days were beginning to align. Expectation, intention, and human behavior were coalescing into a pattern, though its full form remained concealed. She allowed herself a faint smile, confident that with careful patience, the hidden truths of the coastal train passenger would reveal themselves in due time, and she, as always, would be ready to discern them. The following morning arrived with an unusual crispness, the kind that sharpened the edges of even the smallest observation. Miss Marple, taking her accustomed early walk, noted the clarity of the air and the subtle light reflecting off the distant waves. Yet even the tranquility of the morning could not mask the lingering tension in Stretton-on-Sea. Villagers whispered in small clusters along the high street, their eyes darting toward the station, as if expecting the drama to resume with each footstep. Miss Marple moved at a leisurely pace, her senses attuned not to the words themselves, but to the gestures, the fleeting expressions and the hesitant motions that betrayed the deeper currents beneath polite conversation. By mid-morning, she had returned to the station. The cordon remained, though activity had shifted from inquiry to casual observation. Inspector Harris continued his rounds, questioning villagers and attempting to construct a timeline, but he remained largely focused on tangible evidence and apparent connections. Miss Marple, however, knew that the key lay not in obvious objects or statements, but in the subtleties, the minor discrepancies, the overlooked actions, and the gestures that seemed insignificant until considered in context. Her attention was drawn to the leather-bound case Peter Langley had recovered. It had been opened and skimmed by the inspector, who appeared satisfied with its apparent lack of incriminating content. Miss Marple, however, noticed something that seemed to have escaped both him and the conductor. A faint indentation on one page suggested a pressed object, and the way a single corner of the leather cover was worn indicated repeated handling in a particular manner. Such a small detail, unnoticed by most, hinted at importance, care, and perhaps concealment. She allowed herself a quiet smile. These subtle clues often proved more revealing than the overt evidence the police so eagerly sought. Meanwhile, the tall man in the black coat had shifted closer to the edge of the platform, still maintaining a careful awareness of his surroundings. Villagers whispered, their imaginations filling in gaps with conjecture and supposition. Mrs. Lacey, leaning over a gate with her parasol raised, suggested to a small group that he had something to do with the deceased's arrival, a story quickly embraced by others. Miss Marple, observing the man's measured composure and deliberate gestures, noted a slight irregularity. The faint hesitation before he responded to a call from the inspector, the subtle tension in his fingers as he adjusted his coat. These small signs, she recognized, could betray intention or concealment and would demand careful attention. As she circled back toward Peter Langley, Miss Marple asked quietly, "Did you notice anything unusual about the case itself or the way it was placed on the platform?" Peter's brow furrowed. "Nothing much, ma'am. I only noticed it lying near his feet, and that he seemed careful with it." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones most revealing. Placement, handling, hesitation, all of these speak volumes if one watches closely." Peter nodded, though his understanding of her meaning remained partial, as was often the case. The conductor, who had been hovering nearby, seemed suddenly compelled to interject. "Miss Marple," he said, voice low, "there was something else I saw. Perhaps yesterday, perhaps earlier, I cannot be certain. But there was a scrap of paper, torn from something near the last carriage. At the time, I thought it trivial. Now I'm not so sure." He glanced nervously at the tall man in black, who appeared unaffected, though Miss Marple noted a faint tightening around his eyes. The paper might seem inconsequential to the untrained eye, yet to Miss Marple, the very fact it was overlooked suggested it might hold significance precisely because no one expected it to matter. With a measured calm, she asked the conductor to retrieve the scrap, and together they examined it. It was small, inconspicuous, yet bore faint markings, notes in an almost illegible hand, partially smudged by moisture and handling. A casual observer might have dismissed it entirely, but Miss Marple's experience taught her that the most trivial-seeming items often contained the most vital insights. She studied it carefully, noting the pattern of letters, the pressure of the ink, and the partial words that suggested urgency or secrecy. Already she recognized a thread connecting the deceased, the package, and someone who had followed events with quiet attentiveness. The villagers, unaware of this subtle discovery, continued their speculation. Peter Langley looked on with growing unease, uncertain whether he had played a helpful or disruptive role. Mrs. Lacey whispered to a neighbor, certain she had recognized a motive, while others contributed further conjectures about passengers, packages, and imagined quarrels. The inspector, confident in his own conclusions, remained largely unaware of the significance of the paper and of the delicate patterns of behavior Miss Marple was observing. As late afternoon approached, shadows lengthened over the platform and the faint cry of gulls drifted from the shore. Miss Marple, holding the scrap of paper gently, reflected on the emerging connections, the deceased's expectation, the careful placement of the package, the fleeting shadow observed by the maid, the deliberate movements of the tall man in black, and the nervous gestures of the conductor. Each detail, though minor, was a thread, and together they formed a tapestry she could already begin to discern. She allowed herself a small, private smile. The hidden clue had revealed itself at last, subtle and overlooked, yet powerful enough to point the way. In the unfolding interplay of anticipation, concealment, and human behavior, the next stage of the investigation would become clear. Miss Marple, as always, would watch quietly, waiting for the precise moment when the patterns fully revealed the truth. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue over Stretton-on-Sea, yet a quiet tension lingered on the platform. Miss Marple, seated near the edge of the station garden, watched the ebb and flow of villagers and officials with her customary patience. Inspector Harris moved briskly among the crowd, calling for statements, but there was a subtle sense of incompleteness in the proceedings. He had focused on the most apparent threads: the tall man in black, the recovered package, and the sequence of events at the platform, but Miss Marple had long sensed that the truth lay in subtler details, ones that only patient observation and knowledge of human nature could reveal. She had spent the morning reviewing the scraps of information collected over the previous days, the nervous conductor, Peter Langley's hesitant handling of the case, the fleeting shadow seen by the maid, and most recently, the small scrap of paper found near the last carriage. Each of these seemingly minor observations now formed a network of interrelated actions and intentions. The deceased had arrived anticipating someone, carrying a package of importance, and yet the circumstances of his death had been carefully orchestrated to obscure the true story. Miss Marple rose and approached the cordon, where the inspector was speaking with the villagers. "Inspector," she said gently, "if I may, I think there are elements of this situation that require a slightly different perspective. One that considers intention, observation, and subtle human interaction, rather than just the apparent sequence of events." The inspector, polite, but slightly impatient, nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. If you believe you can provide insight, please proceed." Miss Marple's gaze swept over the villagers, noting their positions, gestures, and expressions. She turned first to the conductor. "You mentioned yesterday a certain unease regarding the deceased. What was it that gave you this impression?" He explained once more. The careful handling of the package, the anticipation in the passenger's movements, and the faint sense that he expected someone on the platform. She nodded thoughtfully, allowing the details to linger in the minds of the bystanders. Next, she addressed Peter Langley, who clutched the recovered leather case as if uncertain of its significance. "You observed how the deceased carried this package?" she asked. Peter confirmed, adding that the passenger had handled it with extreme care, almost protective, and that its placement on the platform suggested intentionality. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to rest momentarily on the tall man in black, who maintained an almost imperceptible distance, observing her with measured interest. "And the scrap of paper," she continued, lifting it gently for all to see. "Though small, it provides critical information. Its partial notations indicate urgency, a need to convey something in secrecy. The deceased anticipated contact, and someone else was involved, not in plain sight, but through careful observation and subtle coordination." The crowd murmured, intrigued and confused. Mrs. Lacey clutched her parasol, trying to reconcile her earlier assumptions with this new perspective. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the man in black. "You arrived in Stretton-on-Sea not by coincidence," she said softly. "You watched the movements of the deceased, the interactions on the platform, and the approach of the villagers, yet your caution betrayed concern, not malice. You are not the orchestrator of this death. That distinction belongs to someone far closer, whose intent was hidden behind appearances and careful manipulation of expectation." The man's composure did not waver, yet Miss Marple noted the faintest tightening of his lips, the micro-reaction that confirmed her assessment of his role. Turning to the crowd, she continued, "The true orchestrator was someone who had knowledge of the deceased's habits and movements. Someone able to anticipate his actions and arrange circumstances in a way that suggested accident or misfortune. That person relied on the credulity of those around, on the distraction of the inspector, and on the seemingly trivial gestures of others to conceal their intent. And yet they left behind signs, small, subtle, human signs, that reveal the truth." Her eyes settled on Mrs. Harding, who shifted uneasily. "You saw what appeared to be innocent interactions, the attention to gestures, the careful positioning. But in truth, you knew precisely when and how the package would be placed, how the deceased would respond, and how others would interpret each movement. The scrap of paper, the nervousness of the conductor, even the fleeting shadow observed by the maid, were orchestrated to conceal your involvement. And it was you who ensured that the passenger's final movements were guided toward his fate." A hush fell over the station. The inspector's face shifted from puzzlement to realization as he connected Miss Marple's observations with the evidence and testimony he had collected. Mrs. Harding's composure faltered. The subtle micro-signs Miss Marple had catalogued, the nervous glances, the hesitant postures, the careful avoidance of direct engagement, were laid bare in their meaning. She attempted a final protest, but Miss Marple's calm, unyielding gaze made further denial unnecessary. "The death was not random," Miss Marple concluded gently. "It was carefully constructed, relying upon human tendencies to misinterpret, to overlook, and to assume. The threads of expectation, anticipation, and subtle influence reveal that what appeared accidental was in truth deliberate. And so the mystery is solved, not through force or forensic proof, but through the patient reading of human nature, as always." The inspector stepped forward to take control of the situation, placing Mrs. Harding in custody while the villagers murmured in astonishment. The tall man in black, Peter Langley, and the conductor all remained unharmed, their roles clarified by Miss Marple's careful exposition. As the evening sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the station, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The patterns of behavior, the anticipations, the concealed intentions, all had revealed the truth. Walking slowly toward the village center, Miss Marple considered the enduring lesson of the affair, that beneath the surface of even the most ordinary human interactions lies a complexity capable of both deception and revelation. And while Stretton-on-Sea would gradually return to its gentle rhythms, the memory of the coastal train, the package, and the careful orchestration of human behavior would linger as a reminder that nothing in human nature is ever truly trivial.